The telegraph changed newspapers forever. I'm Amy Pandolfino, and in this presentation, we'll explore when the telegraph rewrote the news. When the telegraph was introduced to the American public, some predicted it would be the death of newspapers. After all, how could the newspaper compete with the lightning-fast travel of information via the telegraph? To the contrary, newspapers adopted the use of the telegraph as a powerful tool to gather, share, and even sell the news. Rather than weakening the position of newspapers, it provided them with an increasingly dominant role in society. The telegraph and the way it was implemented in the U.S. changed forever the landscape of American news and politics. News became a commodity to be bought and sold among news brokers, raising ethical questions. The focus of newspapers shifted from promoting political party aims to making money. A few large companies were able to take control of most of the nation's news. Newspaper editors found themselves in the unique position of personally influencing public opinion on a scale previously unknown. The amount of power wielded by individual editors gave rise to the concept of nonpartisan or unbiased news as an ideal. Lastly, the format of newspapers changed dramatically, taking on a form that would not be unfamiliar to readers today. In this detail from a painting made in 1848, a local gentleman reads the war news from Mexico to all the gathered locals. This was actually a pretty common scenario in the mid-19th century. Thanks to government subsidies, newspapers traveled anywhere in the U.S. for under 2 cents each, while personal letters might run as high as 50 cents. Even so, a single newspaper subscription might be shared among an entire village. I found an enchanting account of just such a moment in the historical records of Oneonta, New York. One day, in 1838, the New York Tribune was delivered by stagecoach to the Oneonta house. There, in the combined barroom and office, a news story about the first telegraphic message was read aloud to, and I quote, a number of prominent citizens. There were only 2 subscriptions to the Tribune in Oneonta at the time. The local historian goes on to describe in detail how the very conservative, and I assume elderly, Dr. Case then declared an infernal humbug and walked out. Prior to the telegraph, newspapers were mostly local affairs. A paper might serve subscribers within an area of a few hundred miles. This engendered a wide variety of writing and reporting styles, as well as putting into print a rich and varied survey of American opinion. The New York Tribune, enjoyed by Oneonta residents, would aspire to a national scope, but very few papers even came close. A clear social trend possibly unique to the United States was the democratization of the news such that everyone had access to news information, regardless of where they lived or their social status. Papers were highly partisan, backing particular political parties, as was expected. The New York Tribune supported the Whigs and would in time begin favoring the Republican Party. Advocacy journalism was the accepted norm. Papers existed to promote a cause or a party. Let's consider the challenges faced by news correspondents during the Mexican-American War in 1847. The telegraph went no nearer to the front lines than Petersburg, Virginia. Instead, news reports from battles in northeastern Mexico were hand-carried along miserable roads, often guerrilla-controlled, to the port of Matamoros. Then couriers would travel by boat to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. The news would then be shipped via steamboat to Montgomery, Alabama. A network of local trains and stagecoach lines connected Montgomery, Alabama, to a train depot in Georgia. Only then could trains carry messages directly to the northeastern state. At a cost of about 50 cents for a mere 10 words, the telegraph was the most expensive way to send a message. When telegraph offices opened in New Orleans, Morse charged patrons $2.50 to send 10 words to New York. Newspapers were eager to use this new technology to gain a competitive edge and had to economize. 5 daily papers in New York City formed a cooperative, the New York Associated Press, to share the high costs of reporting on the Mexican-American War. The New York Associated Press, a precursor of today's Associated Press, became a news broker, trading in a new commodity, the news. Newspapers shifted their focus from the promotion of various political parties to profit making. With just a few companies in control of all the big stories, antitrust lawsuits were sure to follow. There were those who felt the concentration of so much influence in so few companies was politically dangerous. Lastly, news reports became fairly homogenized. Although different papers held highly divergent views, they were all buying the same basic stories from the same sources. Political economy theory recognizes that a country's communications infrastructure is shaped not only by the limitations and advantages of the communications technology itself, but by political decisions and the driving force of the industries that provide the technology. The key technologies in this case include the telegraph, the railroad, and the printing press. Politically, the decision to privatize railroads and the telegraph while heavily regulating them was huge. Additionally, postal subsidies for newspapers and antitrust laws played large roles. The major industrial powerhouses included the railroads, Western Union, and press associations such as the New York Associated Press and the Western Associated Press. Railroads soon adopted telegraph time, not just so that their trains could be on time. Railroads could save a lot of money by running on only one track. In other words, trains would travel in both directions on the same track. This made timing critical, and railroads were eager to adopt the telegraph for communication between stations and setting the time. Railroads already had right-of-way to run tracks all over the country and could easily allow telegraph lines to be put up alongside the tracks. This made for a natural partnership. Often, telegraph offices would be located in the train station and telegraph lines followed the tracks almost everywhere they went. Applying affordance theory, the telegraph afforded a way to tell the time and coordinate trains along single tracks. And the railroad was starting to crisscross the continent, having obtained right-of-ways for railroad tracks. It could afford the telegraph the space needed for telegraph lines. Morse originally envisioned his technology as something of an extension to the U.S. Post Office, used for carrying messages of state importance and the like. Congress wasn't buying, and Morse had to seek private investment. Western Union, which had worked closely with the military and government during the Civil War, built on these relationships. Hiring of skilled telegraphers with military backgrounds helped, but most significantly, Western Union administrators brought legal, political, and organizational savvy to the company. In time, Western Union completely dominated the long-distance telegraphy market. It was in fact the first company to truly transcend state lines. Worried by this fact, Congress passed the Telegraph Act of 1866, an initial step toward implementing some governmental control. These events laid the foundations of today's news infrastructure and industry. The first communications empire was Western Union. Later industries would develop similarly. Telephone and television would be privately owned industries, but highly regulated. The relationship between government and industry would squeeze out competitors and lead to monopolies. For example, accusations of monopolizing the news and antitrust lawsuits cropped up as Western Union allied itself with certain railroads and news agencies, and not with others. Interocean Publishing won their antitrust lawsuit against the Associated Press, but the state of Illinois lost when AP simply pulled up its stakes and moved to New York, where cooperatives had more latitude. The Associated Press could buy and sell news just as well from New York as from anywhere. Since the advent of the telegraph, traders in such commodities no longer had to work through middlemen. The telegraph focused on profits and relationships with businesses and the press. Without government ownership, it was never priced for use by the middle class, never promoted as a technology for the common good. It is telling that somewhere by the 1850s, it was common for merchants to blame newspapers for their hard times. The telegraph was held partially to blame for the speed at which news traveled. Newspapers were even blamed for starting the Mexican-American War by sensationalizing events in Cuba. Muckrakers, what today we would call investigative journalists, took on a variety of social issues through the press. Ida Tarbell exposed the greed and corruption of the Standard Oil Company and the Rockefeller family through a series of articles. At a different end of the spectrum, yellow journalism was popular in spreading sensational stories with little regard to facts or ethics. The concept of unbiased news began to be seen as an ideal sometime after World War II. It is one way to respond to the sensationalism and dishonesty of yellow journalism, or what we would call fake news today. Opponents of so-called unbiased news reporting argue that the bias remains. What is and what is not reported on reveals the bias of the article, but this bias might not be obvious to the reader. After the 1850s, newspapers came to resemble the papers we read today. Because words were at a premium in telegrams, the most important facts were sent first. If the story was being sold by a press association, opinions were not included. That was left to the editor purchasing the story. Journalistic styles were changed to appeal to wider audiences, resulting in the loss of local styles. The editorial page took on the familiar format we know today. Journalists discovered the power of including personal interviews in their news stories. The employment of foreign correspondents became the norm, and the first weather reports were printed. Before the telegraph, weather reporting was a moot point. The telegraph afforded the gathering of weather data in real time. As a consequence, it became possible to study meteorology and, in time, weather predictions. In this 1860s weather report, barometric pressure, temperature, dew point, wind direction, cloud cover, cloud types, and sea disturbance measurements are reported from stations all over England. There are some clear historical parallels in today's news market. After World War II, news agencies really saw themselves as public servants. All that changed in the 1980s when major corporations took over the news industry. Making money, getting high ratings became a priority. As a result, the major networks are now owned by only a handful of companies. Networks have strong opposing opinions, but not a lot of diversity. One game changer, however, is the internet, where anyone can promote an item as news. For good or ill, news brokers, during the heyday of the telegraph, leveraged their ability to rapidly disseminate time-sensitive material to greatly expand their influence, shaping the landscape of American news and politics. The government encouraged privatization of the telegraph, setting a precedent that would be followed as new technologies such as the telephone, radio, and television emerged. The government's desire to control and regulate news agencies led to a high level of monopolization in the industry. The telegraph became an instrument of the wealthy only, due to early pricing and marketing decisions made by industry leaders. All of these factors shape the information environment we live in today.